What's up, guys? I'm Adam. Today, we'll be discussing the effects of triangular trade and the impact it had on European, African, American populations and the economies. Many of these effects, such as the exploitation of labor, mercantilist policies, and cultural and racial divides, are still present in the fabric of our global trade systems. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, the triangular trade system was implemented to exchange goods for enslaved Africans. This transatlantic system enforced the shipping of African slave laborers to the Americas, where they would work to plant and harvest crops such as cotton, tobacco, sugarcane, chocolate, and coffee. These products were then shipped back to Europe, completing the triangular cycle. Triangular trade connected the geographic locations of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. This system profoundly shaped the economic prosperity of European nations and wealthy African elites. This was extremely detrimental to the social and cultural fabric of the African nations from which the slaves were forcibly removed. Triangular trade was a component of a larger mercantile system, shaped predominantly by European navigation routes and mercantilist policies. The concept of mercantilism established that the most successful way to accumulate and maintain economic power was through increasing the number of exported goods in return for precious metals, for example, gold and silver. The practice of mercantilism resulted in amassed wealth for European empires. Port cities such as Liverpool, Lisbon, and Nantes thrived as centers for trade of precious metals, slave labor, and agricultural products, which were mainly sourced via the Americas. This economic success allowed these nations to make a prosperous transition during the Industrial Revolution. However, this was contingent upon the inhumane treatment of enslaved Africans, as well as the slaughtering and displacement of Native American tribes in U.S. colonies. The triangular trade system had other negative impacts on both African and Native American communities. The practice of chattel slavery was rooted in the agricultural economy and established deep racial divides in the South. Because African slave labor grew integral to the success of plantations, a larger number of slaves were being continuously shipped over to U.S. colonies. The transatlantic voyage was brutal, and this forced migration led to the loss of millions of lives via disease, abuse, and starvation. The repercussions of the triangular trade are still present in many aspects of European, American, and African society. The economic impact of the triangular trade further entrenched systems of inequality that benefited European powers at the expense of African and Native American communities. As well, European nations grew increasingly wealthy from the profits of slave produced goods. African economies were destabilized and reshaped around the capture and sale of people rather than sustainable development. Some African elites did profit from the trade, but this often led to internal conflicts, militarization, and corruption within local kingdoms. Meanwhile, the constant demand for enslaved laborers encouraged violent raids and warfare between neighboring groups, disrupting the balance and structure of pre colonial African societies. The Middle Passage, the leg of the triangular trade that transported enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, was one of those most horrific aspects of the system. Africans were packed tightly into the holds of slave ships, chained together in inhumane conditions with little access to food, clean water, or sanitization. Disease spread rapidly, and death was common. It's estimated that over 1.8 million Africans died during the journey. Survivors of the Middle Passage arrived in the Americas physically weakened and traumatized, only to face a lifetime of forced labor and abuse. The brutality of the voyage symbolized the total disregard for African lives under the logic of profit driven exploitation. At the same time, Native American populations faced devastating consequences as the triangular trade supported the expansion of European colonies across the Americas. As enslaved Africans were brought to work plantations, native lands were seized and cleared for large scale agricultural use. The indigenous people, already ravaged by European diseases and warfare, were displaced and marginalized by the growing colonial economy. The labor of enslaved Africans and the displacement of Native Americans worked hand in hand to build a plantation based system that prioritized European profit over human life and cultural survival. This twin exploitation solidified a legacy of racial oppression and land dispositions that persisted in both African and indigenous communities today. The cultural impact of the triangular trade system on African nations was particularly devastating. Tribes were wiped out as millions of Africans were captured and sold into slavery. By forcibly depopulating African tribes, European colonizers interrupted the traditional methods of governance and created a widespread instability, poverty. African nations had insufficient populations to maintain agricultural production, economic growth, and cultural continuity. Entire oral histories, dialects, and social customs were endangered and destroyed as Africans were stripped of their tribal identities and forced to live within the boundaries of nations drawn up by European colonizers. Triangular trade set up the precedent for the future patterns of the type of labor exploitation and greed that punctuated global trade. The economic structures built during this period prioritized profit over human rights, a model that continued into later colonial and industrial systems. European powers refined their control over resources and labor in other parts of the world, using similarly methods of coercion and dominance. As a result, many formerly colonized nations entered the modern era at a significant disadvantage, facing poverty and political instability and weakened infrastructure. These ongoing challenges reflected the long shadow cast by transatlantic slave trade and the mercantilist ambitions that drove it. The triangular trade gradually came to an end in the 19th century as abolitionist movements gained strength and moral oppression to slavery grew across Europe and the Americas. Key legislation such as the Britain Slave Act of 1807 and the U.S. Act prohibiting importation of slaves in 1808 made the transatlantic slave trade illegal. Though illegal trading persisted for several decades, full abolition of slavery followed in many countries later in the century, often after long political struggles and resistance from those who profited from the system. While the trade officially ended, its legacy, marked by economic disparity, systemic racism, and cultural loss, continues to affect societies around the world today. Ending the triangular trade marked a critical turning point, but the work of confronting and repairing its consequences remains ongoing. Hey guys, thank you for watching our video. Especially big shout out to my group members Fatima and Cole. Fatima really cooked on those images, and she did a great job drawing them with a lot of detail. In addition to this, Cole did a great job on all the script and bibliography and that type of stuff. So really big shout out to them. And finally, shout out to you, Miss Shani. You're a great teacher, and you really got us through all those trials and tribulations through AP World, and you prepared us very well for the AP test.